Hi, Noah. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation to the podcast episode of the ICA Health and Wellness. It's really nice to have you. And before we start the discussion and the podcast, let me introduce you a little bit to the audience. So, performance psychologist Noa Kageyama is on the faculty of the Juilliard School and the Cleveland Institute of Music. Formerly a conservatory-trained violinist with degrees from Oberlin and Juilliard before completing a Ph.D. in counseling psychology at Indiana University. Noah specializes in teaching musicians how to utilize sports psychology principles and demonstrate their full abilities under pressure. Noah's work has appeared in media outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, NBC News, CNN, Slate, WNYC Studio, Strings Magazine, Musical America, and Lifehacker. He maintains a coaching practice, teaches hundreds of musicians, educators, and learners through his live online courses every year, and authors the Bulletproof Musician blog and podcast, which reaches over 45,000 subscribers every week. So Noah, again, thank you very much for being here with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So we heard it in your bio that you started as a performance major, and then you switched sometimes in your life to a performance psychology. So can you tell a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so I started out as a 2-year-old Suzuki kid, at Ithaca College summer Suzuki camp. Apparently this is my idea. I told my parents that I liked music. I don't remember this at all, but it all seems to be partly my idea. And they were always very supportive and very interested in music. One of the first things that they bought when they got a job and got married and moved into an apartment, even before they had a dining table and a living room couch and things like that, was an upright piano, which they still have to this day in their living room. And so that was one of the first things. Their neighbor friends were like, we can't play cards on this upright table. We can't eat on this upright table. Like, when are you going to get a dining table? And so then, the next month, another delivery van pulls up and pull out some boxes, and they got excited. It's like, okay, now there's a couch. Now there's a table to eat and play cards at. And no, it's actually a stereo system, record player, speakers, and so forth. And so all this to say, they were, they weren't musicians themselves, but they really loved music. And so it's sort of natural that I guess I would have started listening to music in the home and playing the piano as a little tiny kid. And so I continued on, I think just assuming that I would go into a career in music for my whole life. It was just what I did. And, summer festivals throughout my lifetime, youth orchestra, chamber music, theory lessons, teachers in various places all around the state and beyond. And then, there was one thing though in hindsight that kind of sticks out. Like I was never, I loved playing, of course, but practicing was a real struggle for me all the time. I mean, it is for a lot of younger folks, but it seemed like it was particularly a struggle for me. And it never quite really got over that. And then finally, so I went to Oberlin and went to Juilliard eventually. And while I was at Juilliard, I took this class with Don Green, who I'm sure you and many of the folks listening right now are familiar with. He was teaching a performance psychology class at Juilliard at the time. And I'd never heard of sports psych before. Like that was totally new to me. And so I wasn't really expecting a whole lot, honestly. It's like, what can I learn from a former Army Ranger, diver who doesn't very, openly says that he doesn't play music. So I wasn't sure what I was going to learn. But, from day one, from the very first day, looking at the syllabus and I very quickly learned how much there was that I could learn about performing better and even practicing more effectively from this sport performance expert. So that started changing how I felt about practicing. So I did start practicing more, not through willpower, but because I actually started seeing more improvements stick from one day to the next. I started seeing those improvements translate and transfer to the stage, to performances, started feeling differently. in studio class and in lessons and on stage, recitals, competitions, and auditions. And I started playing much closer to the way that I thought I should be able to play in those scenarios as well. And so, as I started seeing these changes in the practice room and on stage, I started getting increasingly interested in learning more about this area of psychology, sports psychology. And in this, in the meantime, I also started discovering that even though I was practicing more and things were going better, I still wasn't that interested in like doing the work in music. I still loved playing, and never trade any of that for anything. But at one point, I think my second year, I did one of those big every 4-year type of international competitions, and I just couldn't get myself to prepare thoroughly enough for it. So I went into it. First round stuff was fine, more or less, but the second round stuff was kind of iffy. The Bach chaconne that I was supposed to play, I discovered the night before the second round that it actually wasn't memorized. I just never bothered to try and see if it was memorized, and so I assumed it was, and it turns out it wasn't. So, for the next 16 hours after discovering that, I just, all through the night as I was sleeping and every waking moment, I just listened to it over and over, like in my CD player, hoping that it would stick. And most of it did, almost all of it did. But, there's one moment where it got a little bit lost. And so I think that was my undoing in the second round. But regardless, I hadn't really learned the third movement of the concerto yet. And that's a showpiece I hadn't touched in a while. So I was not in a good position for that, but what stood out to me was that I played as well as I could have hoped to have played. I played probably better than I should have played, and all the stuff that I learned in Don's class, in terms of being able to stay focused and being able to get into the zone, as it were, and manage my nerves and not be distracted by all these extraneous judgmental thoughts while playing and so forth. Like, all of that went pretty awesome and was pretty invaluable in that moment. And so that made me even more interested in learning more about the psychology of performance and learning and so forth. And so, after that, I wonder what happens if I just pursue this. And it's a little bit uncertain because I didn't know what that would lead to. But that's how I ended up putting the violin down after Juilliard, went to Indiana, did a master's and Ph.D. in psychology, and ended up continuing to go down that path to this day.
Which is great. Obviously, you have helped thousands of people in your life, so you're reaching a wider audience and really something that you experienced personally on your own skin. I remember reading in your story that you would be practicing, and sometimes the performance was absolutely stunning, and sometimes it was subpar. And you couldn't figure out what was the problem there. And I think many of us might be in that situation at many times in our lives as performers, musicians. And I remember my life, there were years when I was practicing because I thought my fingers were moving on the clarinet as good as I needed. And it was not the fingers, it was actually something else, the breathing mechanism that really restricted me and tensed up things in my body. So how do we know what we need to work on when we practice? Is that psychology? Is that more areas of technicalities? How do we diagnose? How do we really pin down what we need to work on to be successful in performance and in different scenarios?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think we're much better at this in other parts of our life. So if we're taking a geometry test, or we're taking the SATs, or taking any subject, foreign language, I think we're not perfect at it, but I think we're much more easily able to identify where our skills are weaker and where our skills are stronger because we take tests a lot of times. I don't think we enjoy taking tests. I mean, my daughter's studying, preparing for the SATs right now, and I don't think she's having fun necessarily, but the way that the test is set up, it's pretty clear which areas she doesn't have to worry about too much and which areas she might need to work on a little bit more. The equivalent for us, in music, and I think athletes are great at this too. They are competing all the time. They're playing games, matches, etc. It's relatively apparent which skills need more work. It's like, oh, my backhand is weaker than my forehand, etc. Or, my shooting range only goes out this far, and, beyond this point, I become this percentage of a shooter. Whereas for musicians, I think we resist and put off the one. You can probably see where this is going. We resist the one thing that would help us be able to better identify what to work on in the practice room, and that's recording ourselves. I never liked it. I mean, I had all sorts of recording devices my parents, made available to me, and I found every excuse to not do it. The main excuse being it's not ready yet. It's like, not ready to record. I need to wait until it's ready. And of course, it's never ready.
Yeah.
Then you get to, the week before, and suddenly you're cramming to do some recording, and it makes you feel like not even performing anymore because it sounds so much more terrible than you think. So unfortunately, I think that tends to influence what we spend our time on, and our avoidance of the things that might actually need the most work, or kind of inhibits us from being able to discover, I think, like maybe you did in your situation, the actual things that are holding us back from being able to sound better. And so we kind of end up shooting ourselves in the foot by avoiding the thing that would actually really be helpful to us. And so it's hard to get people to record more willingly, but one way of doing that is to record much smaller bits of music, right? And to also record a before and after, so that we get a sense of actual audible improvement, tangible improvement, which can really help to build confidence and make us actually want to record more, and actually make us want to practice more when we see things actually improving in that sort of way. So one is, recording sooner and more often and in smaller doses to begin with. But also the timing of recording matters. If we record at all, I think there's a tendency for us to record after we've practiced as opposed to before, because obviously we're going to sound better after we've practiced. And so that's the version of our playing we want to hear. The unfortunate thing, of course, is how we sound after we've practiced is an artificially inflated version of what our actual skill level is at, right? It's like when you go to a master class and you play for somebody, there's nerves and your hands are cold and, things don't feel comfortable.
Absolutely.
And then afterwards, the teacher says, let's try this, let's try that. And it sounds so much better the second time. And then it's always like, why can't I play like that? Well, it's because now that you've put one version out there, you've warmed up, and also you have more ideas on what little adjustments need to be made so you can hit it more exactly the way you want. And so that information didn't exist before you started playing. Now it does, and so you can make it sound better. And unfortunately, that then gives us an artificially inflated impression of where our fundamental skills are actually at. So it's not fun, but record first before you've practiced, and then practice, and then if you want to, you can record afterwards. But then the other factor that's really sort of deceptive is that concrete learning, or the learning that takes place in the same way that, sure, I can look at a phone number and have it in my head and be able to repeat it to you maybe for the next 10 or 20 minutes. But, ask me what that phone number is a couple hours later or tomorrow morning, probably won't be able to remember most of it.
Yeah.
Right? So that means that very little of that phone number actually was learned. I had it temporarily, but not permanently. And so it's much the same with practice. And unfortunately, the only way to know if the practicing that we do today was effective or not, it's not how we sound at the end of today's practice session. It's how we sound at the beginning of tomorrow's, before we've practiced again. That is an indication of how much learning is actually taking place. And we're not very good at gauging learning and progress on that extended time scale. We tend to look at how do we sound now and how quickly did we get there in this practice session. And that, unfortunately, is deceptive. And so all these things sort of conspire together to create the situation where we think we sound a certain way, and we can play that way, but that's not where our fundamental skills are actually at. And then, we go on stage and discover that, unfortunately, too late to do anything about it. So, yeah.
No, absolutely. These are very good thoughts, and actually that leads me to a remark as well as a question. The remark comes from Amy Leiker, who has been the past president of Association for Body Mapping Educators, and she said, when talking about recording ourselves, she said it just gives you more options to change for the better. Just really, and you see yourself with an external eye that you wouldn't be able to. It's just like hearing music. When we hear a music, do we hear it through our bones and our own ears, what we produce, or do we really hear it as an external source being recorded or having been recorded and looking at it with a different eye? So it really just, the only thing it does, it just gives us more options to change and to evaluate. And so my question would be, do you think that musicians don't like recording themselves because they are perfectionists?
I think, I don't know if there's any data on this in terms of whether musicians are more prone to perfectionism or not, but I think the challenge is we're always able to, our standards are always a little bit higher than what our current capacity is, I think. Right? Like we can always hear something that we wish would be a little bit better before we actually have cultivated the skills to actually make that happen. And it's, I think, always like that because, you know, then when we're able to solve those issues, then we can hear something even more subtle that we couldn't hear prior to that. And that continues. And so I think that's maybe one of the things that makes it so, not unpleasant, but just frustrating to listen to ourselves. Hearing it just feels like we're always not quite where we want to be or where we could be. I think the one thing that changes, and who knows, if knowing what I do now and I went back in time and tried to convince my younger self to record, I don't know if I would have been more excited about it, but I do know that hearing things change from before to after, now that I've had a chance to work with other people and seeing what their reaction is, you know, when I teach this class online, everyone, doesn't matter what level they're at, whether they're adult learners returning to instrument after decades away, or younger students, or professional musicians, or you know, educators and teachers, no one is excited about recording and then sharing those recordings with everybody else in the group. However, I get so many notes afterwards on how that was the most impactful part of it, just getting in the habit of recording, because it's not just recording and then being like, oh crap, that sounds terrible. It's recording, identifying specific things that you can actually improve, tangible things that you can improve, and then figuring out how to address those things like you did with your breathing, it sounds like, and then hearing the difference afterwards, and then seeing that difference stick the next day, 2 days later, a week later. Like that is incredibly empowering, and that's what changed for me in grad school when I started learning how to practice more effectively, and it became motivating to practice because I knew things were going to get better, and I knew that I could figure out how to make them better. And then, yeah, to see them stick, it's just, I mean, that's one thing that I wish for all students and all musicians to be able to experience, that feeling of being empowered in the practice room and seeing things actually improve in very noticeable ways.
Absolutely, yeah. Record not to cast judgment on yourself, because
Right.
we might be going to that recording session with that mindset, rather than really pinpointing things that we can work, and it's really easy to change those minor things that we might want to change during the recording. Thank you very much. That brings me to my next question, and about the subject of courage. Because we master courage whether we practice, whether we perform, whether we prepare, either audition, a concert, whatever that is, finals. How do we do that? How do we master courage?
This is also related to, and sure, there are mindsets and different psychological or mental things around courage, certainly, but this is also, like many things, a factor or a result of how we tend to approach practicing. There are a variety of different sayings about practice. You know, practice makes perfect, perfect practice makes perfect, practice makes permanent, etc. And I think there's a lot of truth in all of those things, but one thing that I think we tend to take a little too literally is, you know, perfect practice makes perfect. You know, it's very debatable, or we could get into the details of like, what does perfect practice actually mean, or what does it look like? But I think our assumption when we hear that phrase is to assume that perfect practice means not making any mistakes. And the word mistakes also has to be defined a little bit more clearly too, and I don't know that we'll go that deep into it. But because certainly, yes, there's a lot of research would suggest that the more times we do something, the more likely our brain is to think that that is the way we want to do it. So if we do something that doesn't actually get us the desired result, whether it's a particular kind of sound or sloppy articulation or, intonation, our brain doesn't know what in tune and out of tune is necessarily. It doesn't care. It's just going to do whatever it's most comfortable or familiar with. And so, yeah, if we are playing something flat consistently, then that's not great, because that's probably going to happen on stage as well. But in terms of playing more freely and courageously and so forth, in a lot of ways, it's very easy for us to be so fixated on technical accuracy, independent of any expression, that, I mean, for me at least, hopefully I'm not the only one that's guilty of this, but, I grew up thinking, all right, let me just get all my ducks in a row first. Let me just make sure everything has a good sound, everything is in tune, everything is clean, and then I'll add some expressiveness on top. It's like, make some toast and then I'll put some jam and butter on top, right? Make it nice, not just dry bread. Of course, the problem is is that those are two different mechanical challenges, and we've kept them separate. And so now when we combine them, now we have to relearn the piece basically, to be able to play it in a different way that requires different set of motor skills and demands challenges. So so that of course was counterproductive for me, and I didn't realize that for, embarrassingly to say, probably a good couple decades. And now I wish I could go back and change that. But it's very difficult. I think as a young kid, it's very clear what in tune and good sound is, right? It's very tangible. The expressive stuff is a little fuzzier. It's a little harder to understand, the absence of knowing anything about score study or theory or listening. A lot of it's just instinctive at that point. And that's, of course, there's nothing wrong with it. That's awesome. It's good to cultivate that. But it's just trickier, I think. And so in terms of building courage, all this to say, I don't know that we practice taking these tiny risks in our practice room. And so the skills that we cultivate tend to be much narrower than they need to be in order for us to be able to take those risks under pressure, with nerves kicking in, on stage, and feeling confident in those risks. So there are a number of musicians, of course, who have said things along these lines. Pamela Frank, I think in a video or maybe a podcast episode, once talked about the value of practicing with 1,000% expression, right? So playing more expressively in the practice room than you would ever want to on stage, almost inappropriately so, right? Just to make sure that you've cultivated those skills and that those risks you've taken are not going to feel as risky when you're on stage.
Yeah.
There's a great video in which she even talks about playing scales expressively, right?
Yeah.
Whatever concerto you're playing, take scale arpeggios in that key and play those scales expressively so that you've practiced doing those things you're going to do on stage.
Absolutely.
And there's actually a whole area of motor learning, it's called variable practice, where you don't want to just practice one specific skill exactly the way that you're going to do it. So in this one very kind of basic study, they had a bunch of kids practice throwing bean bags at targets at different distances. One group practiced throwing at a target 3 feet away, another group practiced at 2 feet and 4 feet. And they were all tested at 3 feet. And you probably see where this is going too. You would think that the 3-foot group, because that's what they practiced, should have an advantage. But actually, no, the group that never practiced at 3 feet, they practiced at 2 feet and 4 feet. They were actually more accurate at 3 feet than the group that only practiced at 3 feet. So, I mean, the musical equivalent of this is not necessarily transcribing everything up and down and aiming for the notes above and below the ones that you want, although I know some folks will do that and that can be valuable. But the idea is something more along the lines of what Toby Apple, who's on the faculty here at Juilliard, has said he does when he practices, which is he says he doesn't practice what he's going to do on stage so much as he practices all the things that he might do on stage. And that's a very elegant way of incorporating more variability into how we practice. So it means, yeah, we have a clear concept of the kind of sound that we want, the kind of articulation we want, the way we want to shape the phrase, but don't just practice a very narrow version of that in your practice room where the acoustics are very safe or dry. Practice a wide range of those things so that whatever the acoustics may be or whatever the music director or the conductor wants from you in that moment or whatever is happening in the ensemble around you, you have much more flexibility in being able to do a wider range of things that might be more effective in that particular moment.
Absolutely. Plus, I think we can't really segregate technical aspects of playing, performing, practicing without really seeing the results, what it would be when they are together, because they are so intertwined. Technicality and musicality, they are so intertwined. And when we are in the zone, let's say, or we are perfectly focused on what we're doing, we change, our technical skills changes. So I found that from Dr. Green, actually, I learned it from him. Really put yourself into the performance situation, that stage, that audience, that magnitude, and just practice like that. And that actually really helped me a number of years ago to better prepare for performance. And so obviously by what you said, you're saying absolutely take risks, right? Don't hold back. Whatever you need to do in the practice room, just do it. And raise your gamut, widen your gamut of playing, so that you gain just very valuable feedback and experience in the practice room that might be replicated and even played in a simpler way on the stage when under pressure. So we talked about this taking risk. Another thing that I would like to address regarding courage, about negative emotions, negative thoughts, should we cut them off? Some performers do cut them off from their minds. If it's negative thought, if it's negative emotion, from their hearts, really just alienate themselves. Or should we be really united with those emotions and turn around? What do you suggest?
Well, sometimes it's difficult to shut all of that off. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of indications that these negative voices, honestly, it's not even sometimes the negativity or the positivity of these voices. I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience where, things are actually going really well. And then you're telling yourself, oh, look how well this is going. Awesome, right? And then as you're thinking about how well things are going, suddenly things fall apart. So it's really more the judgment piece, that when we're on stage, when we're performing, there's this list of rules for artists that this artist, Sister Karita Kent, put together many years ago. And I think one of them was something like, never analyze and create at the same time, because they're different processes. And
Absolutely.
on stage, we're creating. That's the goal, to be creating, not analyzing. That's later when you listen back to the recording, or in the practice room when you're working. And so the real challenge is that we don't practice that mindset where we're just creating very often, because most of our time with the instrument is spent practicing, where we're analyzing and judging and evaluating and problem solving and making adjustments and so forth. So we're not very good at this creating headspace. I think jazz musicians tend to be, by the nature of their training and what they do, better at it, because when they're improvising, they can't also be analyzing and evaluating quite as much. And there's some interesting research out of Johns Hopkins with jazz pianists and freestyle rappers, which suggests that, there are very different parts of the brain that are active when you're playing something from memory, and then thus more inclined to be evaluating and making comparisons and so forth, versus when you're improvising freely and can't really afford to analyze and critique in that same sort of way. So part of the challenge, of course, again, comes back to the way we prepare ourselves in the practice room, is to get better at knowing when it's time to be evaluative and say, okay, good job on, articulating that in that way, or, oh, it sounds like this is rushing. I think you might need to work on this, that, and the other thing. And then times where you're just, and this is maybe where also recording comes into the equation, where you're just playing, trusting yourself, focusing on the shape of the phrase, the kind of sound that you want, colors, expressive details, etc., and then not worrying about the evaluation at that moment until you can listen back to the recording later. So, easier said than done, but that's one of the key fundamental challenges that I think is probably the most important point, rather than the emotional or the valence of the words that might happen to be going through our mind at any given point.
No, absolutely. I believe it was Arnold Jacobs that said, we practice a lot of technicalities, but when we are on stage, you forget about them because you just can't think about how I finger and things. It just music, focus on the music, focus. Absolutely. That leads me to the next thought: focusing. One of the big things that you mentioned in your explanation relates to focus. What does focus sound like when we practice and when we perform? What should we be focusing on? What is more than focus? Or rather, concentration or tunnel vision. And then what is too much of that? What is too little of focus? What does it look like, sound like?
Yeah, so this is something we could talk about for hours or days. Fundamentally, the challenge is, I think like we already talked about a little bit, optimizing our focus for effective learning in the practice room is almost the opposite of optimal focus for performing on stage. In the practice room, it's really helpful to have a really clear concept of what it is that we want, right? Without a clear concept of what we want, whatever happens is just, it's, well, as Leon Fleischer said, it's an accident. There's no intention behind it. Whatever happens, happens. Your muscles just kind of do it for you, and maybe you like it, maybe you don't. But it's helpful if we have a clearer concept of what kind of sound we want, like what's the importance of this note relative to the one before it, where is it all going, what's the underlying emotion behind it, or the rhythmic pulse that we're trying to stay in line with, what else is happening around us. Like all these details can help to inform these choices we make about what it is that we want. And then it's not just having that concept, but then being able to listen carefully enough to what's actually coming out, whether live or with the recording, as Amy was mentioning, you said, to then see, well, what's the gap there? What's the discrepancy between what it is that I really, really want and what's actually coming out of my instrument and my muscles? And then trying a few different things, going back and forth to try to figure out if we can shrink that gap between our intention and what we want with what's actually happening and what we're getting. And, that's always a work in progress. I think,
Yes.
like you said earlier, what we want is always going to be slightly ahead of what it is that we're able to figure out how to do. But that, that's what makes it all fun, frustrating, but also really fun and satisfying and meaningful over time. On the flip side, in performance, like you were saying with Arnold Jacobs' concepts, if we're too focused on the mechanics of how to produce what it is that we want, as we were in the practice room, this is where motor learning is very clear. It interrupts the automaticity of these skills that we've cultivated, because there's so many little details on little tiny things that our muscles have to do all in the right sequence at the right time in the right sort of way. Like, we can't think and monitor our body and compare the results with what we want quickly enough to be able to execute these things fluidly, which is why, and Gabrielle Wolf is the person who's done a lot of research in this area, who's found that we really give ourselves the best chance of performing optimally if we can focus on what's called, distal external focus of attention, focusing on the goal of our muscle movements, not the muscle movements themselves. So focusing on what kind of sound do we want? Where is this phrase going? How does this blend in with the other folks around me? Expressive emotional details, etc. And that, assuming that we've done all the work in advance of figuring out how to produce that kind of sound, or what kind of crescendo exactly do we want? Where does it start? Where does things, do things swell? What kind of a accelerando, and how quickly is it going to speed up? Like, all of those details have to be planned out and experimented with and mapped out, and ultimately, hopefully internalized in muscle memory, where we don't have to think about every tiny little detail. And assuming that that's been done, that work has been done, we've made those decisions, and we've done enough repetition to really be able to retrieve that the first time on command, then the way that we cue that up or access that is to focus on the goal of those muscle movements that produce that, as opposed to the muscle movements themselves. So So yeah, it means that we have to practice in a certain way in order to learn skills. We have to practice being able to produce those skills without thinking in the same way that we were when we were developing and learning the sequence of skills in the first place, which doesn't mean that we have to do more practice. It just means that we have to be cognizant of when it's time to practice one thing and when it's time to practice the other. Just like Arnold Jacobs said, you have to forget all that. Well, it's easier said than done, because if we don't practice just forgetting it, letting go and doing it, then we're not going to trust ourselves to be able to do that when it really matters most.
Yes, absolutely. There are different sources that use focus and concentration the same way, and different sources that use focus and concentration different ways. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that, kind of differentiate and see which one is good when and where, and yeah, what can you tell us about focus and concentration?
For me, I tend to think of concentration as being sort of the raw capacity to focus our attention on any given thing, right? You know, if we don't have enough sleep, if we're, you know, not eating consistently or regularly, it's just, you know, that feeling, and maybe some who have had that sort of brain fog after COVID remember the feeling of just not having the stuff up there that's necessary to be able to pay attention to any specific thing for any particular period of time. Okay. The metaphor that sports psychologists often use in terms of focus is like the spotlight metaphor, or like a flashlight metaphor, where you can direct your focus to anything in the room. You know, you're in a dark room, you want to make sure you don't step on anything, so you shine the flashlight, you know, down. And a lot of flashlights nowadays also, not only can you point them where you want, which is one aspect of focus, but you can also narrow or broaden the beam of light, right? So if you broaden the beam of light, you can see more stuff, but it's a little bit more faint. It's not quite as bright. But you could also narrow the focus and make it really narrow, and it's super bright there, but then outside of that narrow area, it's completely dark, and so you could step on something. So that, I think, is a helpful way of thinking of things too. You know, Nidifer is the person who first, I think, several decades ago, started, one of Don Green's mentors, started talking about the two dimensions of attention, right? So there's the axis of internal attention versus external attention. You're paying attention to how my bow might shake, versus externally focusing on, you know, how the sound in my section is blending together, or what the conductor might be doing up there in terms of what he or she wants us to do in that moment. You know, and then there's narrow and broad, right? So narrow would be focusing on the pad of my first finger on the string and making sure it's not squeezing too hard, and broad being, you know, tension in my upper body and maybe shoulders across my back. So, you know, you could use those two dimensions to figure out where our attention is most useful at any given moment in time. There might be times where it's really important to focus on making sure my thumb is loose in a particular section, or, you know, my bow is making good contact with the string. And I apologize in advance for using violin examples, because I know that it's not the audience, but for me, that's the thing that comes most naturally. And other times where it's much less important to focus on what my instrumental setup might be, and more important to focus on, you know, the ensemble sound, or what's happening in a different part of the orchestra, or a different member of the ensemble in that moment, because that's much more tied to what we're doing in that moment as well.
Absolutely. So yeah, we have to shift our focus very fluidly, of us, minor, major things, of different people we might be playing together with, minor, major things, and sometimes we have to do that really quickly as we are performing, so that we can coordinate our play really well. And so when we concentrate, then what would happen to us instead of focusing? How would it change our behavior of performing?
In that sense, I would probably find myself using those two terms relatively interchangeably as well. I just tend to use the word focus more because it's a little more specific to me in terms of, you know, focusing on what. I guess you could do that too, concentrate on what, but a lot of times when I hear the word concentrate, at least for me, it just seems a little bit more vague and diffuse, where there's not necessarily a target that's specific. Whereas when I think of, focus, it almost lends itself to there being a target. Focus on what? Right? Focus on this particular kind of sound that you want to come out and that you have in your head for this particular moment, or focus on what the conductor's doing, or focus on what the horn section is doing in this moment, etc. I think if we're just generally aware, that can be good at times, but it's not necessarily always the case that we just need a general awareness. Sometimes we need to be much more specifically focused on something. Otherwise, something else will capture our attention and draw us away from the things that are most important to think about at that moment.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. I also really like what you said, that sometimes our focus is a wide angle, and sometimes it's a very narrow angle. So besides focusing on different things rapidly, interchangeably, we also gauge the angle of our focus. If it's really narrow or it's really wide, and there is another skill that we could talk about later. But I would like to mention a little bit. So we talked about courage, and something that is closely related to that is confidence. When we talk about courage, we might talk about courage as a sequel or a preparation to something, an event that will happen, as opposed to confidence when we need that while we are performing an event. What are ways we can raise our confidence level? And one of the things that I learned in Dr. Green's book was pretty different levels of confidence and ways to approaching raising the level of confidence. Well, how can we raise it?
For me, a big part of it is associated with self-efficacy, which develops in the practice room, right? So throughout the first, 20 years of my life when I was practicing, I, had some level of confidence, certainly, because I knew that I could sound good. But when it came time to perform, my confidence would predictably wane and become a little more suspect, because what I didn't have confidence in was my ability to play the way that I wanted to the very first time under pressure. And even in terms of practicing, one of the reasons why I don't think I practiced very consistently is because it all sort of seemed like a crapshoot to me. So even if I practiced a lot, sometimes I'd go to my lesson and still not sound very good. And other times I wouldn't practice very much at all, and I'd go to my lesson and I'd sound great. And same with, even studio classes and to some degree performances. And so it wasn't until I started seeing that I could improve in tangible ways and have those changes stick in the practice room, where fundamentally the thing that changed was I was thinking concretely enough about, okay, what's the problem? Which note is out of tune exactly? And is it sharp? Is it flat? Why does this phrase sound so dull? What needs to change it? What needs to be added? And how do I make that happen physically or technically with my instrument? What needs to change with my vibrato so I can open it up more, and how much vibrato needs to be there, and how much bow am I going to use? Where in the bow am I going to use to produce this kind of sound, and so forth. So all those things that I started thinking about more concretely then led to much more specific plans about what to do from one note or one phrase to the next, which was maybe the one thing that gave me the most confidence on stage, in terms of feeling like it wasn't just a crapshoot anymore. If a note was out of tune, or if, a phrase was rushing, I knew why it was rushing technically. Maybe I couldn't do anything about it then because the pressure was just too much, but I knew how to make it better. I knew once I had experienced that under pressure that I could fix it and I could solve it for the next time. And then the other thing that was maybe even more important was, once I started having clearer ideas, expressively about, what's the meaning? This phrase comes around twice. Sure, I knew for ages that I should do it differently each time, but just sort of randomly do it differently. I didn't have a particular plan for how that fit into the larger context of the piece. And whatnot. And once I had these very clear ideas on like, no, this is how it should go, not just because I heard someone do this in a recording, but I agree with how they did it for this reason, having looked at the score and, et cetera. The underlying harmonic structure and how else things were laid out in the piece and so forth. So once I started having other things that I was excited to share besides just a nice sound and generally reasonable intonation accuracy, I was much less concerned about like little mistakes or things not being good enough. And so I know that's not really like a psychology answer to confidence per se, but I think the self-efficacy that came from being able to not just solve technical problems, but understand the underlying reason for the problems, and to also then have a feeling that I had something else to offer beyond just the basic technical elements, maybe did more for my confidence than any particular like self-talk strategy or anything else in the psychology realm. And it all, of course, connects to what we know about confidence in psychology. But yeah, those were the things that I think were most immediately impactful for me when I was at that point.
Thank you. I think that thing happened the same way with me. Definitely attaching meaning to what I do and why I do it definitely helps shift focus from the technical skills to the side of expression and how I want to express, rather than analyzing as well as performing or creating the same way or at the same time. So I found it to be very, very effective a practice tool and skills to have, definitely. The other thing is that I heard from what you said is that there are foundational aspects of playing, structural, and then ornamental. And then once we finished, place the fundamental aspects, we don't have to worry about them. Then we worry about the structural aspects of building up a piece for a performance. Once we've done that, we don't worry about that because we know it's right there. And then we work about the minor things, the phrasing, the expression, the rate of accelerando and piano and all that. And so once it's done, we know that we have done it, and we've done it good, and it suffices us, and it really gives us pleasure. And I think with those two things and skills, knowing that we can do that repeatedly, as well as attaching meaning to those things, that the way we want to perform a piece, then it really helps raise confidence on a regular basis. What are some of the things that can really throw us off still in performance situation, like say external things that we might encounter that we didn't expect? It might be really an audience. It might be someone sneezing or coughing while we perform, or just, I don't know, we look at someone in the eye as we perform and accidentally catch that gleam, and we just don't like that look. What can we do so that we are not thrown out of our safe zone?
One of the things that can be really helpful, that again we tend to avoid, is trying to put ourselves in as many of those kinds of situations as we can, so that we are better able to figure out, well, what is our tendency in that sort of moment? Where does our mind go? What happens physically to us? And then how can we come up with some sort of a plan? Athletes call this like a recovery ritual. And a lot of times athletes talk about it in the context of having made a mistake, right? So totally messed up on a play, or made some sort of an error that affects not just your own performance, but maybe the team's performance. It's really hard to not feel like you've let your team down, or that you've let yourself down, and to kind of obsess about that for too long. But then, you're not in the right headspace for the next play or the next point, et cetera, and then it's more likely for things to kind of snowball downhill. So that sort of a thing can be helpful certainly as well in planning out what is our optimal response to any sort of distraction or unfortunate thing. So if I missed a shift, what do I want to focus on next? If the pianist starts playing too fast, how do I want to deal with that? Or if they start playing too slow, how do I want to deal with that? Or um, if the conductor asks for this, or they make this sort of a face, and I know when they make this sort of face, typically I feel like I have done something wrong, and I get really tight and self-conscious at that point. So how am I going to respond in the best possible way? So supposedly Michael Phelps, when he did visualization, because a lot of this, yes, ideally we can do mock auditions or perform for people in lower stakes, lower pressure situations and discover what our tendencies are when we get distracted or other things happen. And, people can distract us on purpose if they're friends, and we can see how we react and how to better respond. But aside from that, some of it we can do through visualization, right? We can imagine based on what's happened to us before, perhaps, like, oh, I remember this one time in a performance and happened to notice right as I was waiting backstage that this person was in the audience, and then my mind went here. So in all those sorts of situations that we've had or that we can imagine, we can visualize what we would want to do and kind of plan that out in our head, so we don't have to necessarily experience that multiple times. And one of the things that the great swimmer Michael Phelps used to do apparently was to visualize a variety of different ways in which matches could go wrong. And one of those ways is where your goggles fill up with water, apparently. I don't swim, so I don't know too much about all the things that can go wrong, but apparently that's one of them. And so I think it was in the 2008 Olympics that did happen to him, maybe the 100-meter butterfly finals or something like that. And, of course, he ended up winning anyway. And then people asked him later, on the news and so forth, what was that like? And at some point, his response to one of those questions, what was it like, was pretty much like I imagined it would be. And that confused the reporter, I think, and his coach later explained that, no, he meant that literally. Like, it happened the way he imagined it would, because he imagines that sort of thing happening. And I think what we're good at, generally speaking, is imagining all the what-ifs. What if this happens? What if that happens? But then we kind of stop there. We get stuck, like, obsessing about, it's like, oh, wouldn't that be terrible? It's like, oh, and then this happens. Instead of doing what Phelps did, which was to, okay, let's say that happens. How would I love to respond to that in the most effective way, so I come out of it still feeling good about my performance or the audition, etc. And so that takes a little bit of work to figure out what our optimal response could be. But having done that and then imagined doing it a bunch of times, then that what if doesn't have the same sort of power for us going into the performances, because then we know, okay, if that happens, yeah, that's going to suck, but this is how I'm going to respond. It'll be okay. I feel good about my response.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's a really good one. Good story. I didn't know about that. But definitely a very successful athlete. Now that brings me to another area of confidence, praises. Obviously, we are human. We're also emotional as well as thinking being. Also, we need input. We need feedback from others. We really value those, whether it's needed or not needed, wanted or not wanted, expected or unexpected. But really, I think we as human beings, we reflect on those, regardless of the intent and then the source. And what can you say about praises? Wrong, positive, negative praises, good praises. What are those, and how we can praise others that it really benefits them?
Well, yeah, praise is a real tricky thing, because it depends on the individual in front of us. So, for instance, one factor is their existing level of self-esteem, right? So if they are relatively low in self-esteem, if they're already not very confident in their abilities, and we use what's called person praise, we say, oh, you're such a good clarinetist, or you're so musical, or you're so expressive, or, we praise them for things that come across as being relatively fixed and unchangeable, just a natural talent kind of thing, or part of their character or their personality. Not that those things can't change, but they feel relatively fixed. And if we do so to make them feel better after they've just had a really bad studio class performance, or maybe they didn't advance, past prelims in an audition that they were really preparing for a long time for, et cetera. And then, we provide that kind of person praise. It's very tempting to do that, but for someone, actually, regardless of self-esteem, if we tend to do that kind of praise, there tends to be a greater experience of shame. There's an interesting study that came out about 10 years ago, found, yeah, there's greater shame felt when we receive that kind of person-based phrase or praise after a loss or failure. Whereas that's particularly the case for folks who are lower in self-esteem. So, for someone who is lower in self-esteem, or even someone who's, at a normal level or a pretty average or typical level of self-esteem, giving process praise seems to be more effective and doesn't tend to elicit this feeling of shame. And process praise would be things that are more changeable, or things that they have more control over. Things like, really loved how you approached that phrase, or I really like the way in which you have worked on your vibrato in such a way to be able to widen it a little bit. If we make it clear that this is praise that they're receiving as a function of the way in which they approached the task or worked on the task or improved their skill set in a particular way, because that is something that they have control over, tends to feel different, even if they receive that, after, an audition that didn't go their way, or a performance that didn't live up to their standards of what they wanted or what they expect from themselves. So that's one little tiny thing. But even when it comes to ourselves, as well as hearing things from our mentors and teachers, maybe you've read this as well. It's one of my favorite studies of John Wooden, the famous UCLA basketball coach, that was done. This is done, I think, I forget the exact year. I want to say it was in the 70s, mid-70s perhaps, where a couple of psychologists watched his practices, during his last season of coaching. And they were just curious to find out, well, what does he do? Because he had unprecedented success. At some point, I think maybe his team won something like 7 NCAA championships in a row, or some insane number. And they were just curious to find out what he's doing that seems to lead to such great success on the court. And one of the things that they looked at was how much praise and criticism he gives his athletes. And I always ask my students in sort of a trick question sort of way, like, what was the ratio of percentage of praise and criticism? Was it like 50% praise of these 2,300 something acts of teaching that he engaged in these recordings? What percentage was praise? What percentage was criticism? And when I phrase it that way, is it 50-50, or is it twice as much praise to criticism, or is it more criticism and less praise? And people give me various numbers. The true percentage, though, actually, is about 7% praise and about 7% criticism. So most of everything that he said, most of the words coming out of his mouth during practice, I think around 75%, had no judgment associated with it. It was purely instructional. Things like, pass from the chest, or, turn your hips this way, or do more of this, less of this, etc. It's just instructional stuff, like just kind of dry, not really associated at all with good or bad. It's just, you did this, let's do it more like this. And I think part of that can happen in the practice room for ourselves, right? We tend to be very judgmental in our own thoughts. We say, oh, that was terrible, or, sounds awful. But instead of good or bad, if we could just focus on, okay, this is what I want. It sounded like this. What can I do to get it more like this? And try to take the judgment evaluation out. That can be a helpful way of starting to clean up our internal dialogue a little bit in a way that can also transfer on stage. And as teachers as well, certainly it's good for students to know when they've worked hard and they've approached something in a way that is going to help them continue to make progress in that way. We want to reinforce those things, certainly. But yeah, being careful with our judgment, especially because we don't know how students respond to it. I mean, I'm sure, as you've seen, some students have had experiences in the past with, different coaches or teachers or whatever, that it could be difficult to accept critical feedback, even with the judgment taken out. So the main answer to your question, I think, is just being attentive to how it's received, because it means an adjustment might need to be made. Even if we feel like we're doing praise correctly, as it were, it's a little more complex than that, of course, from person to person.
Absolutely. That actually makes me think the coaching experience and the psychologist observing that, it makes me think about one. So a very famous religious leader, Joseph Smith Jr., said when he was asked how he leads people, he said, "I just teach the correct principles and people guide themselves." And I think that really comes back through what you said, giving immediate good feedback, workable feedback to people, and they just really guide themselves. They fix their own problems by giving them the good feedback of what they need to change at the moment, at the time. And my question that would come from giving feedback, how do we potentially gauge what would be a good feedback to a person to give if we were to give a feedback? Let's say I heard an amazing concert and I want to say some good things to that person. How do I know what feedback will be well received? Do I know? Will I ever know if it will be received well, or we can't gauge that?
That I think is hard to gauge. I mean, unless you know the person really well and you know what maybe they've been working on, or what, you know, some of their sensitive spots might be, or what they care about and whatnot. For me, I think with those situations, it's almost a lot of the advice that I find myself offering in those situations to performers is more about how to receive the feedback that you've been given, whether it's by fellow colleagues or, you know, strangers essentially in the audience. Because I think most of us anyway, tend to kind of suck at receiving feedback. We tend to either try to dismiss it or attribute it to colleagues just being nice. We're not very good at internalizing positive feedback from others, especially after performances where we're almost never going to feel like it was as good as we would have wanted it to be. So I think just being able to practice accepting feedback graciously is one of the things that can also help with us being a little bit more confident in ourselves as well.
So the question I'm going to ask you then, what are some of the thoughts that you would like the audience to remember from this discussion?
So for me, you know, I wish I could go back and tell myself these things, and who knows whether I would have listened to, you know, older me or not. But the idea of being intentional about when you're practicing to hone and refine and develop skills versus when you're practicing to prepare for performance and practice what you're going to have to do in performance, whether that's where you're going to direct your attention or practicing in such a way where you're really testing out the recordings and so forth, whether your intentions are coming across the way that you want the very first time under a little bit of pressure because you know it's recording and maybe you have a friend also there present listening and so forth. You know, I think a lot of times we spend a lot of time practicing, hoping that all of this will come together for us when it's time to perform. But because we don't test it out early enough in advance, we're often not surprised, actually, in performance, but sort of unpleasantly able to discover that some of the ways in which we prepared didn't transfer as effectively as we would want. And then what concerns me about that, too, is, and this is maybe less so for more experienced or professional musicians, but, you know, for younger musicians who are not able to have as many performances as athletes often do, right? Athletes are often competing and they get a sense of performance quite frequently often, whereas with musicians we don't often get to have performances other than maybe a weekly lesson, which is not quite the same. I worry that sometimes younger musicians jump to the conclusion that they're missing something innate within them that enables some people to be effective performers and that some people just don't have, so they can't perform effectively. So I think in reality, a lot of us as little kids may be more inclined to be like born performers. We're very happy to ham it up in front of family and friends and so forth. And then at some point we become more self-conscious, especially if there's a skill involved that we've worked on and there are other people doing that skill as well, and we have a sense of comparison and so forth. So I was at a workshop once at a university, and a mother and her son came up to me afterwards, and the son didn't say much, he was just sort of standing there, but the mother essentially, not in these words, but the message was kind of clear, essentially explaining how, some of the students in the youth orchestra, the musicians in the youth orchestra seem to do fine in seating auditions, but something seems to be wrong with my son because he crumbles under the pressure of these seating auditions and doesn't play the way that he can. So what's wrong with him, basically, was what the question was. And, how is it so easy or different for these other people that seem to be okay? And the main thing that I just wanted her to take away from the conversation and also the workshop was that a lot of these skills that can help one perform more effectively under pressure and be ultimately more confident and comfortable under pressure are not skills that we intuit or skills that just naturally happen to be developed or learned. They're things that sometimes we very intentionally have to work on and spend time on. But they can, at least as was in my case, learning some of these at a relatively advanced age and state, can be really transformational in terms of how they enable us to not only sound more like we think we can sound under pressure, but start to have many more positive experiences of performances, which I think most of us have had. We've all had, whether intentionally or accidentally, some of those really exciting performances where even if we started off nervous, by the end of it, we were really engaged and having a good experience. And so yeah, I'd love more younger musicians to know that that's very much possible for all of us. But it may not necessarily come as naturally to some of us, just as many other things often don't.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Noah. Well, thank you very much as we wrap up this discussion for staying with us, for sharing your experience and expertise and profession with us, as there are many musicians that are in need of it, even if they might not know it. And as the ICA organization posts these podcasts as well as video recording of the discussion, we'll make materials, links to materials available on those websites. So Noah, thank you very much for staying with us for today's episode.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Chava.